My name is Thomas-Troupe. I am a graduate dietetic student at Eastern Illinois University. This is my systematic review on faith-based interventions for chronic diseases in the African American community. I chose this topic because African Americans have the highest rate of developing chronic diseases than any other population, and my family is deeply rooted in the church. My father-in-law is our apostle, and many of the members of my church and family members have been diagnosed with either hypertension, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, or a combination of these disease states. This review was done with the intent of finding an intervention that could be utilized in my church to help my family and church members work together to better manage their health. This is the outline for my presentation. First, I will give an introduction on the prevalence of chronic diseases in the African American community and discuss how religion can play a part, whether positive or negative, in the African American church. I will then do a brief lit review on my 10 sources, after which a brief discussion on what I found in the studies. I will then discuss the strengths and weaknesses of each of the studies. Then will be my conclusion on to my question, followed by questions. Chronic disease is often preventable through early detection, exercise, and healthy diet, but when left untreated, it can lead to a decreased quality of life and death. The U.S. government spends billions of dollars per year to reduce or prevent chronic disease. 90% of the government's healthcare budget is spent on reducing or treating chronic diseases. Yet it remains the leading cause of death in America. Because we are all grad students, I will not go into a lot of details on each of the diseases, but I will briefly provide some background on the prevalences of each disease and death rates in the African American community. It is a known fact that being obese increases the risk of developing all other chronic diseases. As you can see, compared to other populations, African Americans have the highest rate of obesity. A factor in reducing obesity is physical activity. According to the Office of Minority Health, African Americans are 20% less likely to exercise than whites. 30 million people are diagnosed with diabetes every year. Type 2 diabetes being the most common form of diabetes. Minorities carry the highest risk for developing diabetes, but African Americans are diagnosed at a larger rate than any other population. As you can see, African Americans have a 77% higher risk of developing diabetes than whites. That rate is the highest out of all minorities. Almost half of Americans have one of the risk factors for heart disease, which is hypertension, cholesterol, or a smoker. 23.8% of blacks and whites die from heart disease. But when you take into consideration that only 14.6% of America's population is black, it's clear that more blacks die from heart disease than whites. African Americans are also more likely to die from cancer. Breast cancer, prostate, stomach, cervical, and lung cancer have the highest death rates for African Americans. By encouraging more African Americans to become physically active and include more fruits and vegetables in their diet, also reduce the amount of fat, the trend of having the highest disparity for death from a chronic disease can start to trend down. One way to combat this issue is through the church. The church is a major part of the African American community. Blacks spend, on average, 3 days a week in church. These days consist of Bible classes, church service, and prayer meetings. The pastor is highly respected in the church. The congregation seeks spiritual advice on a majority of their concerns. Also, meals are served for special occasions such as anniversaries, and church programs are usually centered around the food preference of the pastor. These meals tend to be high in carbs and fat. Religion can have a positive or a negative influence on health. Just for an example, the pastor can promote healthy eating patterns or encourage comfort meals. So if the pastor decided that the entire congregation were going to go on a diet, or if he wanted them to eat only baked goods instead of fried goods, then the congregation would confer to that. He or she can also seek counsels on medical help. Many African Americans do not trust doctors, have their best interests in heart. They believe that doctors want to get them in and out just for payment, or if they're in the hospital and they get sick, that the hospital is more likely to let them die so they can harvest their organs. Religion can be used to encourage a healthier weight. Culturally, it's more appealing to be heavier than thin in African American community. So using the church to influence health is to encourage to lose weight and therefore reducing chances for chronic diseases. Religion also can encourage faith in being healed from illnesses. So that's a positive outlook that you believe that you're going to be healed if you follow the procedures and along with faith in God. But religion can also be dangerous when it encourages members not to seek treatment and rely solely on prayer and fasting for your healing. The purpose of this presentation is to increase the knowledge on the use of faith-based interventions in African American churches and their effects on reducing chronic disease. I hope through this systematic review to answer the question, are faith-based interventions more effective in reducing chronic disease in African American communities than traditional methods? For my research, I use EBSCOhost through the EIU library and PubMed to search for sources. Using the two databases, I was able to locate 186 sources using the keywords African American, Black, church, intervention, and faith-based intervention. I then screened those sources using the inclusion criteria of being within 2009 to 2010, peer-reviewed journals, African American churches, African American participants, and sources had to contain interventions. Sources were excluded if they were not within 2009 and 2019. The interventions were for HIV and AIDS or for mental health. If they were not peer-reviewed journals or if they were duplicates. This left me with 122 sources. The next step was to remove any sources that were not full-text articles. I was then left with 10 sources for my review. An example is shown on the next slide. This is an example of my Prisma diagram. Article 1. Sisters in Motion, a randomized control trial of a faith-based physical activity intervention by Drew, Sarkisyan, Lean, and Mangone, 2010. The primary focus was on physical activity and blood pressure. This was a randomized control trial utilizing 3 churches in California and 71 participants. The intervention was 8 months. The participants met for 90 minutes weekly for 8 weeks, and the follow-up consisted of a monthly meeting for 6 months. The purpose of this study was to evaluate whether an increase in exercise would improve blood pressure, increasing weight loss, and reducing chronic pain when combined with faith-based curriculum. Eligibility requirements was the members had to be African American, they had to be female, the ages were 60 or older, they could not be physically active, so less than 150 minutes per week of exercise, and able to walk without assistance. The intervention group included reading scriptures and prayer before and after class, goal setting, and 45 minutes of exercise. The control group only received 45 minutes of exercise and lectures on unrelated health topics. Both of the groups competed in a step competition using pedometers. The results were at the end of the first 8 weeks, there was no significant difference between groups, and at the end of the follow-up, for 6 months follow-up, the intervention group had reported more steps and the blood pressure decreased compared to the control group, but neither one had statistically significant results. Article 2. Increasing physical activity in Black women. Results from a randomized controlled trial conducted in faith-based settings by Whit Glover et al., 2017. The primary focus was on physical activity. This was a randomized controlled trial using 31 churches in North Carolina. There were a total of 443 participants. The intervention was for 22 months. The participants met weekly for 4 months, followed by a bi-weekly meeting for 2 months, and then monthly for 4 months. There was a 12-month intervention afterwards. The purpose of the study was to evaluate if faith-based intervention would be more motivational in getting participants to exercise and continue to exercise compared to a secular intervention or a self-guided group. Eligibility requirements. The participants had to be African American, at least 18 years old, and a member of one of the churches. The intervention group included scriptures and prayer. There were group exercises and goal setting. The secular group received group exercise only and goal setting. And the self-guided group were given handouts on exercises that they were supposed to follow for the next 10 months. During the first 10 months, both the faith-based intervention and the secular groups significantly increased their steps compared to the self-guided participants. But the intensity of the exercise did not increase. So for those 10 months, they continued to walk, but they didn't walk faster as the longer they walked. All three groups reported an increase in steps, but there were no statistically significance between the three groups. During the 12-month follow-up period, the participants were to maintain their steps. The faith-based intervention and the secular groups both decreased in steps, but were compared to the self-guided group, but they were still had more steps in the self-guided groups. Overall, there were no statistically significance between the three groups. Article 3. Community trial of a faith-based lifestyle intervention to prevent diabetes among African Americans by Satin et al., 2016. The primary focus was reducing weight, fasting plasma glucose, and increasing physical activity. This was a single-blind, cluster randomized trial utilizing 20 churches in Georgia. There were 604 participants. Their intervention was for 12 months. Participants met 1 hour weekly for 12 weeks and then 1 hour monthly for 6 months. They utilized community-based participatory research for this intervention. CBPR allows participants to be involved in all stages of the project. 20 churches were placed in pairs and randomized in the faith-based intervention or into an educational health education group. Participants did not know which group the church had been assigned. Members from the community and university board and the body and soul trial, along with church members, designed this intervention. Eligibility requirements to participate were you had to be African American, between the ages of 24 and 64, not diabetic, and have a BMI of greater than or equal to 25 kilograms. And also no physical limitations, and your fasting plasma glucose had to be less than 126 milligrams per deciliter. The intervention group received classes on reducing calories, reducing fat, physical exercise, goal setting, and problem solving. The health education group received classes on risk improvements for mental health, stress, heart disease, stroke, diabetes, cancer, smoking and violence, and HIV, and how to talk to their healthcare providers. The lessons were delivered by the church health advisors. The CHAs worked in the health ministry and were trained by group lifestyle balance programs on reducing diabetes. So these were nurses and doctors, phlebotomists, things like that. Assessments were taken at baseline, weeks 12, 14, and at 12 months. Also to note, 15.2% of the participants were pre-diabetic at baseline. The results included that 13% of the faith-based intervention had lost 7% of weight, 3% of the health education group had lost 7% weight loss, and there was no significant change for the fasting plasma glucose for either of the groups. There were improvements, though, for the pre-diabetic participants who had a 12.38 milligrams per deciliter decrease compared to the 4.4 milligrams deciliters for the health education classes. But there was no significant change in physical activity between either groups. Article 4, A Dash of Faith, a faith-based participatory research pilot study by Harmon, Adams, Scott, Gladsman, Ezell, and Herbert, 2014. The primary focus of this intervention was fruits and vegetable consumption and fat reduction. This was a quasi-experimental study utilizing 2 churches in South Carolina. There were 23 participants in the study. The intervention was for 8 months. Participants met weekly for 12 weeks and then monthly for 4 months. Based off the 2004 Body and Soul program, this study focused on changing diet and working with the individuals in the church. The pastor, the first lady, and other church leaders helped to design this intervention. Eligibility requirements were that you had to be African American and at least 18 years or older. One church was assigned as the intervention and the second as the control. The participants were the repast committee, which are the church members who plan and cook meals for the church services and their programs. They were given training on cooking healthy meals. And then at 4 months, the intervention groups were demonstrated the skills they learned with the potluck and meeting with the panel board to discuss barriers to healthy meals at the church. So the control groups, instead of getting the cooking meals, got classes on cancer, but the control group was given the intervention classes at the end of the study. Assessments were taken at 2, 4, 6, and 8 months. The intervention group had a large increase in fruits and vegetable intake during the 2nd month, but it was not sustained during the 8th month. There was a total of 6% increase in fruits and vegetable consumptions from the 6th month, though. The control group did not have any improvements, and by the 8th month, there was had been a 29% decrease from the 6th month. So from 6th month to 8th month, there was a 29% decrease. Fat consumption decreased by 0.8% for the intervention group, and the control group decreased by 4.3%. The intervention group had a 1.5 reduction in body fat, while the control group had a 0.8% reduction in body fat, which shows that there was no statistically significance in this study. Article 5, the faith trial. Baseline characteristics of a church-based trial to improve blood pressure control in Blacks by Schlosslitter et al., 2015. The primary focus for this intervention was blood pressure, physical activity, and fruits and vegetables consumption. This was a cluster randomized control trial with an intervention of 6 months. The participants for this intervention met for 90 minutes for 11 weeks and then 30 minutes for 3 months for maintenance. This evaluated the effects of faith-based intervention versus health education on blood pressure. Each church provided 3 members to act as a lay health advisor to deliver the program. Each health advisor participated in 2-day motivational interviewing training. Although each church was randomly assigned as an intervention or control, this was not a blind study. Recruitment was done for this intervention by flyers, posters, church announcements, and bulletin boards. The faith intervention group included prayer, scripture, and faith-based discussion points on health in their group sessions. The control group was given a booklet on reducing blood pressure, and 11 weekly sessions were led by a nonprofit organization. The first week was on lifestyle management, and the remaining sessions consisted of health topics unrelated to hypertension. Blood pressure was assessed at baseline, 6 months, and 9 months. Physical activity and fruits and vegetable consumption was assessed at baseline and then 6 months. The fruits and vegetables and physical activity were all self-reported, and the fruits and vegetable consumption was reported as an increase, but it was still below the daily recommended levels. This study showed no significant reduction in blood pressure. Article 6. Adoption, Reach, and Implementation of a Cancer Education Intervention in African American Churches by Santos et al., 2017. The primary focus was on health promotion using traditional methods versus web-based. This was a cluster randomized trial utilizing 15 churches in Maryland, and there were 375 participants. Interventions consisted of 3 workshops. Participants completed 3 modules with the choice of 1 6-hour class or 2 3-hour classes per module, and there was a 12-month follow-up survey. Community-based participatory research was used for this intervention. Churches were recruited through a nonprofit organization to be involved in, and were randomly assigned to either traditional teaching or web-based. CHAs were 1 male and 1 female were selected by the pastor to lead 3 educational workshops on breast, prostate, and colorectal cancer. Eligibility requirements was they had to be at least 25 men and 25 women. Participants had to be between the age of 40 and 75 and not diagnosed with cancer within the past year. The CHAs either received the traditional 13-module training or the web-based training with a passing grade of 85% for both. All the churches completed the 3 workshops, but traditional groups took longer, 84 days compared to 64 days for the technology group. The workshops were able to educate at least 1/3 of the church members on cancer prevention. The CHAs reported positive rating for the intervention and the participants' engagement in both groups. Article 7. Partners Reducing Effects of Diabetes Predict a Diabetes Prevention, Physical Activity, and Dietary Intervention through African American Churches by Fardy et al., 2010. The primary focus was diabetes prevention for this study. There was a non-randomized controlled trial utilizing 19 churches in Connecticut. There were 39 CHAs, which are church health advisors, and 161 participants. This was a 12-month intervention taught by the CHAs who received 10 weeks of training before leading health education and diabetes prevention classes. This study was in collaboration with the Community Participatory Team, also known as CPT. That team consisted of local churches, the community organizations, and the health department. Pastors selected members of their church to train as church health advisors. The CHAs had 10 weeks of training on diabetes prevention and were responsible for recruiting participants from their church and implementing the intervention classes. Eligibility requirements was participants had to be 18 years or older, African American, a resident of Connecticut, also a member of the participating church, and have diabetes or at risk for diabetes. CHAs elected to combine the educational classes with Bible study, but other churches reached out individually to participants. The community outreach events were also held during the interventions by some of the CHAs, but there were no set guidelines in how the interventions were administered in each of the churches, and many of the participants did not complete the intervention. The results indicated no significant improvements between the groups in knowledge, BMI, diet, or physical activity from baseline to post-intervention. Article 8. The Faith, Activity, and Nutrition Program, a randomized controlled trial in African American churches by Wilcox et al., 2013. The primary focus was physical activity, fruits and vegetable consumption, and blood pressure. This was a group randomized controlled trial utilizing 74 churches, and there was 1,257 participants. The intervention was for 15 months. This study was conducted from 2007 to 2011, utilizing a community-based participatory research methods. Each church established a committee to attend an 8-hour training. 15 months of assistance was provided to facilitate the program. Eligibility requirements were that the members had to be 18 years or older, no previous medical conditions or disabilities, attend church regularly. The committee consisted of a pastor, a health director, and a cook. The committee developed the intervention program for physical activity and healthy eating. Bulletin boards, pulpit messages, and educational handouts were implemented to encourage participation. The results: physical activity increased in intervention churches, decreased in control churches. Fruits and vegetables increased in intervention churches more than the control churches. There were no significant change in blood pressure for either churches. The evaluation from the committee was positive. Participants liked the handout aspect. They liked the exercise and the recipes and what they had learned through their meetings on health education. These results were not significant, but the educational reach to 3,600 members from 74 churches could make a possible impact in public health. Article 9, Implementation of the Fit Body and Soul, a church-based lifestyle program for diabetes prevention in high-risk African Americans, a feasibility study by Dundee and Fields, 2010. The primary focus for this intervention was weight loss and diabetes prevention. This was a non-randomized controlled trial utilizing one church in Georgia, and there were 40 participants. The intervention was for 12 months. Participants met for 12 weekly 1-hour classes, and then 6 months 1-hour follow-up classes. This was a modified fit and body and soul program. 4 church ministers took part in a 2-day training on the Fit Body and Soul program. 12 weekly sessions were delivered to the church advisors to everyone interested, but data was only collected from those selected as participants. Eligibility requirements was that they had to be a member of the church, age 18 to 64, African American, does not have diabetes. The BMI had to be greater than 25 kilograms, and they also had to have a letter stating they were in good health from their primary care physician. The results were 48% lost at least 5% of their body weight from baseline, 26% lost 7% or more, and 14% lost more than 10% of their body weight. Article 10, The Life Project, a community-based weight loss prevention program for rural African American women by Parkers, Cole, Logan, and Davis, 2010. The primary focus for this intervention was weight loss. This was a pre-test, post-test design utilizing 2 churches in South Carolina. There were 28 participants in this intervention. The intervention was for 10 weeks. The participants met for 10 weekly 90-minute classes for education on weight loss. This study was conducted based off of a previous study called Project Joy. 2 churches were recruited by the county extension educator, one designated as a spiritual arm and the other as a non-spiritual arm. The extension educator led the intervention classes during the 10 weeks. Eligibility requirements for this study was you had to be between the ages of 25 and 64, African American, not pregnant or lactating, and agreed to attend all sessions. Statistically significant results for weight loss and blood pressure were reported for the non-spiritual group. Statistically significant results for weight, blood pressure, body mass index, and physical activity and communication with the physicians were reported within the spiritual group at the end of this study. Okay, synthesis. The synthesis for these studies were that there were a total of 199 churches that participated, and there were 3,374 members, church members who participated in these interventions. 8 out of the 10 studies were randomized. Results seem to include that physical activities and fruits and vegetable consumption was easy to increase, but it was a lot harder to increase weight loss, blood pressure, and BMI. I would think that was because the interventions were pretty short. None of them were an entire year in the intervention. They were like 3 months, 6 months, 8 months, and then there was a follow-up study to make it a total year study. Sustainability was also an issue. So during the intervention periods, members were able to decrease their fat, decrease their blood pressure, and increase their physical activity and fruits and vegetable consumptions. But the period in between the intervention and the follow-up, all of the interventions would decrease in some form or fashion. So that was something that needs to be taken into consideration when forming a study of this magnitude. Faith-based interventions are not new. In the last 10 to 20 years, there have been quite a number of interventions and pilot studies done in African American churches. What has been established is that by implementing nutrition education in churches, the ability to reach this high-risk group increases. Just to think, these 10 interventions alone were able to teach in 199 churches and provide nutrition education to over 3,000 individuals. RDNs who collaborate with their community churches would provide a much-needed nutrition education to this and many other high-risk groups that don't respond well to traditional methods. Some of the limitations to these studies were the sample size. While there were a few that were pretty large number of sample sizes, there were quite a few who were also very small. The readiness to change. A lot of the participants were not ready to change, and so there were quite a bit of dropouts in each study, or they didn't do the follow-up. Recruitment is a limitation because there was a possibility for biasness in these studies, because the pastors were the ones that were appointing the leaders in these studies or appointing the people to conduct the interventions. And these could have been family members that they chose to use, or people that they just liked. So if they had been randomized to who was going to lead it, or it had been an outside source, then that would have reduced the chance for biasness. There were incomplete data. Again, a lot of people just didn't do the follow-up. The women's contained mostly women. That's kind of hard to reduce because majority of African American churches are women. The members are women. But to have more men in these interventions might have been helpful, considering African American men are the most likely to die from chronic diseases. The interventions were pretty short. I would have liked to seen more interventions that lasted longer than 6 months, because then that would have established repetitiveness and helped help with the sustainability, because once they stopped the intervention, majority of the people just went back to their regular habits. Strengths. One strength of the study was the use of health professionals in the church. There were at least 2 or 3 interventions that used the actual health professionals that were members of their church. So there were nurses, doctors, and phlebotomists who actually performed the assessments. Another strength was the focus on high-risk population. This was trending towards helping to reduce the risk of chronic diseases and death. So that was a strength. Another one was flexibility. All of the studies were willing to work with the church's calendars because the church can be very busy with anniversaries and choir programs and having to fellowship with other churches. So being willing to be flexible of what days, because if they were having service on a Tuesday night Bible class, then maybe they would hold it on a Wednesday instead. So that was a strength, because otherwise a lot of churches would not have participated, and quite a few didn't participate because their calendars were too full. The focus on multiple conditions. While the primary outcomes were looking at fruits and vegetables or physical activity, they did take in consideration the effects on blood pressure. They took into the effects of weight. They took in the effects of physical activity. So having multiple conditions, looking at diabetes, looking at heart disease, looking at cancer was a strength, because all these factors are a problem for the African American community. Weaknesses. One particular weakness was self-reported data. All of the studies relied on self-reported data. These came in the forms of food logs, exercise logs, whether telephone calls to discuss any, to report any measures, or if these were surveys, they were all self-reported. Another was the potential for bias. Again, the pastors appointed members to either act as a member of the intervention study or to implement the intervention study, and therefore they could have picked their favorite people or picked people who were not qualified for those positions. Another weakness was attendance. Even though majority of the churches and the members agreed that they would participate through the entire intervention and follow-up, there was quite a few people who dropped out in these interventions or did not, they completed the entire intervention but didn't complete the follow-up. Missing data, that would fall within the missing follow-up information. So you didn't have data for those people, which would skew the results and may have seemed like there were more of a significant increase or a significant decrease when there possibly wasn't. The short intervention periods. Although the studies were for a year, the intervention periods were only like 3 to 8 months. I would have liked to have seen interventions for a year, and that way you know that the participants may be more grounded and used to doing following that procedure. Also, the compensation that was given to a lot of the people who were the church health advisors, they were paid during the intervention, but were not paid towards the follow-up. So they may not have did their job in encouraging everyone to stay active and engaged in the interventions through the entire study. And they didn't focus on any other setting outside of the church. So many people have other factors that cause them to not be able to exercise or eat correctly. And that would include work, home, neighbors, family members. So there was not a lot of focus on those things, only on church and fruits and vegetables. So in conclusion to my question, are faith-based interventions more effective in reducing chronic disease than traditional methods in African American churches? That would be inconclusive. There were a lot of missing data, incomplete information. And so I believe that, and there were pretty short intervention studies. The longest was 22 months. So, and that was with 12 months of intervention and 12 months of follow-up. Well, they followed up after the 12th month. So more long-term studies need to be done, because I think that was the only one. So need to be conducted to determine if the effects of faith-based interventions actually has a reducing effect on chronic disease. Okay, implications for future research and professionals. Okay, for future research, it would be well to include all churches in interventions, or see more churches participate in interventions, so that way you can hit not just African Americans, but also all minorities, and also those who suffer from chronic diseases in white churches, also including community centers. I know there are health fairs at YMCAs and other type of community centers, but collaborating more with those community centers may increase the likelihood of reaching more males, because there needs to be an increase in male participation. So by reaching out to the local community centers where they have basketball games and male gendered sports, you may be able to reach more participants. As far as the research for professionals, I believe it would be a benefit to RDNs to build a rapport with the local churches. And that way, the members would trust them more and would be more willing to listen to that advice. It'll be more like meeting them where they are, because then they don't feel as intimidated going to the office and feel like you're not really listening to them or just rushing them through to get paid. So that would be a great implication for RDNs, is to try to build a bond with the local churches. And that way you would be able to reach more minorities and reduce the risk of chronic diseases. I just want to say thank you for watching my presentation. I hope you learned something new today, and I look forward to answering any questions that you might have.